I'm Troy Kirby with a quick look at the 2022 Washington State legislative session. The House Commerce and Gaming Committee heard public testimony on HB 2022, which focuses on social equity in the
So my understanding from reading this, and I want to make sure I'm correct, is that people licensed under the social equity licenses, which are going to be the only game in town here, if this passes until 2030, would be able to place a retail processor or producer near a playground, rec center, childcare center, public park, the public transit centers, libraries, et cetera, and so on. Am I reading that correctly, Peter?
Yes, you're correct in reading the bill that way. It would reduce the buffer, the distance requirements related to elementary and secondary schools to 500 feet. That's currently 1,000 feet.
What is the distance between stores that sell alcohol and cigarettes in terms of schools and daycares, et cetera? Do you know that offhand?
So there are some distance requirements in alcohol licensing, and they're written a little bit differently than in cannabis licensing, but they do use a 500-foot distance as part of the analysis for alcohol licensing. There's a notice process where they notify churches and public institutions within 500 feet of the license. And yes.
In 2020, this body passed 2870, the Social Equity in Cannabis Task Force. This task force had a mission. First, make recommendations promoting business ownership among individuals disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. Second, remedy the harms from the uneven enforcement of cannabis-related laws. That task force legislation was just the beginning of the work required to correct the decades of harm inflicted on communities of color.
And I appreciate you recognizing the social equity and task force that I chair, as I know that this was hard work for the task force members and hard work for the community members to find a way to right the wrongs. But I am proud that both the task force members and the community were able to reach a consensus of recommendations that have now been forwarded.
The I-502 provisions that are in RCW 69 that I mentioned earlier were really about, protecting our young people, protecting communities. It specifically says in there, protecting the impact to a jurisdiction, civil, regulatory enforcement, criminal law enforcement, public safety, and public health.
I would argue that we're bringing cannabis within parity, as I mentioned in my testimony, with alcohol, with vapor products, and also not so much as parity because alcohol, children walk by liquor stores. They walk by liquor in grocery stores. They're exposed to that on a daily basis.
I do want to flag that we do have concerns about what we see as administrative challenges for making grants and loans under Section 8 of the bill. We've been in communication with the prime sponsor about these issues and do believe they can be resolved.
Of the task force, including Chair Representative Morgan and Representative Chambers, Governor Inslee supports this bill. It's big, it's bold, and it's time.
We strongly support the goals of social equity in our cannabis industry and the intent behind this legislation. Our board has selected social equity in cannabis as a top policy priority several years back, leading to our request in 2019 for House Bill 2870, which launched our initial social equity program.
There's been talk about this being parity compared to alcohol. So when you see alcohol being sold in family restaurants, is that sort of the end goal, is to treat cannabis exactly the same as alcohol?
This isn't our bill, and a lot of these issues are not for us to decide. But I would note that there are some differences between alcohol and cannabis, of course, and some of those are disadvantageous for the cannabis industry.
It's a thoughtfully produced bill that is going to be a real benefit for the health of the cannabis industry, as well as make these explicit attempts to right the harms of the war on drugs in the limited way possible that we can with cannabis licenses.
As most of you know full well, our industry is approaching its 8th year of state regulated commerce. This past year, despite contractions across many sectors, the cannabis industry has thrived, producing $1.5 billion of sales revenue, yielding $550 million in taxes for the state, and is still growing.
The Craft Cannabis Coalition is by no means against social equity in the cannabis industry. We are speaking against what we believe is the wrong approach to addressing equity. My family immigrated from the Mexican state of Michoacan, which is nearly 2,800 miles south of Olympia. And those towns that my family lived in for decades, they saw the beginning of what became the war on drugs. When the cartels invaded, my mama's grandfather was shot in the face at a church. My papa's grandfather was kidnapped and held for ransom. And not even 4 months ago, my cousins were kidnapped, and they have yet to be found since they went to try and buy a farm from the outskirts of the town that they lived in. When my family arrived in Washington State in the early 90s, the last thing they would have wanted to hear from our state government is that they were going to rectify those horrors by exclusively providing cannabis retail and production licenses to them. What my abuelo would have wanted to hear is how the state could help open his roofing business. My mama would have wanted to hear how the state could help her be the first person in our family to go to college. I can tell you from personal experience that the communities are struggling to access to capital and investment dollars and the vital tools to get a leg up to start a business of their choosing. That is what makes the bill to reinvest directly into communities so powerful. We must not lose sight of the reality of our struggling neighbors.
30 years ago, our community caretakers spoke against liquor stores, predatory lending centers, and gun stores from taking over the neighborhood. Today, I am that community caretaker, and I speak against flooding Black neighborhoods with pot shops. I speak against placing cannabis stores next to our parks, Black churches, and youth centers. Today, I say this would never be allowed to happen near white schools or near white communities, and that voters in my community had said this 10 years ago. Let me be clear. Craft Cannabis Coalition strongly supports social equity and increasing Black licenses throughout the industry. Heal the harm from policies that created barriers to entry. All new licenses under the state allotment should be exclusive to social equity applicants. Heal the harm. Use your license or lose it. Assign unused licenses exclusively to social equity applicants. Create direct access to capital. Increase Black participation in all industries. Heal the harm.
Thank you for watching the 2022 Washington State Legislative Session.